Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have Dr. Markus Lindner with us from Goethe University, Frankfurt. Dr. Markus Lindner is an anthropologist from, again, the Goethe University of Frankfurt and mine. His research focus is indigenous North America, with a focus on the Lakota and its self-representations in tourism, art, and museums. Being a trained museum anthropologist, he has curated several exhibitions, such as Posted Reflections of Native North America. Here we will also showcase publication from it. And Die Wanderer, Katzinam, Titum und Abbey Warburg, online with Dr. Hilja Drost, and is currently working on the edited volume with Dr. Robert Keith Collins, Unsettling Museum Exhibits, International Perspectives on Paradigm Shifts and Native Community Collaborations, and he is a board member of the American Indian Workshop. Thank you for coming here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Etcha and Christina, for the kind invitation to this lecture series. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's good to mention that I'm from Goethe University 2 times because I studied there, I work there, so I'm one of the few academics who has never changed the university from studying to the tenured position, which is a little strange. Just a few months ago, news media published that U.S. museums like the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago had to close or at least cover parts of its ethnographic exhibitions on Native America due to new regulations of the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. And I will not go into detail about this act. While it is still unclear until today how the new rules will really affect museums in the long term, the president of the American Museum of Natural History, Sean M. Decatur, I actually watched a video today to learn how his name is pronounced, Decatur, wrote to his staff. The changes to the regulations are extensive, including new expanded requirements for consultation and consent for the exhibition of and research on artifacts covered by the law, and implementing them will be a dynamic process. We expect that there will be disruption to our established practices and some uncertainty as we work to better understand how to make needed changes, but there's also tremendous opportunity to learn and to deepen our relationships with indigenous communities, end of quote. Actually, this sounds a little bit dramatic, but even Decatur admits that the closed exhibitions were outdated. He writes, "The halls we are closing are vestiges of an era when museums such as ours did not respect the values, perspectives, and indeed shared humanity of indigenous peoples. Actions that may feel sudden to some may seem long overdue to others." The situation in the Field Museum is similar. While the newly opened exhibition on Native North America, Native Truth, and we will look at that later, was unaffected, some older cases in the Robert McCormick halls of the ancient Americas and of the Alsdorf Hall of Northwest Coast and Arctic people had to be covered because there had not been any consultations taking place with the communities concerned to these showcases. In contrast, there had already been agreements with most other communities represented in the large collection of the museum. So there are only these 2 halls where nobody has ever talked to anybody, so they had to close it. In fact, it is regulations like the one I will quote now that are causing the museums to act. Under the final regulations, consent from lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or Native Hawaiian organizations is required prior to allowing any research on human remains or cultural items. And of course, in fact, there's not so much new in that, except that it's consent is needed. Consultations were always part of NAGPRA, but now it's consent. They have to agree actively. Native American colleagues who are involved in museum processes are not taking this actually too serious, since this is not only affecting museums who have not followed the old NAGPRA rules properly. So if they had done it properly, they were already in touch with the people and talked with them and had consent and things like that. In addition, the new forced consent can also be a challenge for the communities itself, as Robert Keith Collins, and he was also already mentioned, he's Afro-American Choctaw, told me in January. So imagine a tribe which is not allowing to show any cultural items in an exhibition anymore, by purpose, or they just forget to answer. What happens is that they have to be aware that this resistance, willingly or not, will disconnect the tribe from the public, and it may be forgotten after a while because nobody's talking about it anymore. It's not represented anymore. And this may actually matter. Before I go deeper into the topic, I want to give you some information about the perspective from which I look at the topic we are talking about. Being interested in the representation of Native Americans in tourism, art, and museums, and you heard about that for more than 25 years now, I started to focus on the relationship between museums and their native partners, particularly consultants and advisors. Important for this topic is the level of, quote, shared authority, as Amy Lonetree calls it, between the museums and their partners. Less obviously, but probably connected to this, is the question who museum officials choose to collaborate or cooperate with. When I asked museum officials in North and South Dakota how they make that decision in 2019, the curators and directors reacted surprised. Why was that? They had never thought about that actively. What they did was they just built up on already existing networks of people and personal relations, and whenever they choose somebody, they just take from that source whoever seems to fit. So they never really think about who can we ask. It's just naturally. This is not surprising, but important. If you can make a decision, think about it. Will you choose someone you already know, and you can be sure that your perspective will fit to the perspective of the person you will collaborate with? Or will you choose somebody who may be a troublemaker because he or she has another approach to museum work and representation? Will you rate social responsibilities you have personally higher than political aspects if you have to decide to work with your social network of a tribe or with tribal officials, and they have probably competing but both legitimate perspectives and interests on the topics you're working with? So who will you decide? Will you go the easy way or the difficult way? Is it really helpful to go the difficult way? And maybe you have the social responsibilities and you have to go that way instead of the political correct way some way. So it's complicated. My interest stems from being a trained museum anthropologist and from a long-standing relationship with colleagues at museums in Chicago, North and South Dakota, but also here in Germany. It became particularly interesting for me when the Field Museum renewed its 70 years old permanent exhibition. And I was told from several sides that this was only happening because of me. And I'm really angry that they never write it down somewhere. What happened was that on my first visit in 2012, I had visited people at the museum. I had obviously asked the right critical questions at the right time, and at the same time spun the first threads for a network that made the changes at the museum possible. And I did not want to do that. I was just there and asked questions, and I met people, and people got in touch afterwards, and so something happened. So Rob Collins tells me that, and other people I know from, it was because of me, and it's like, okay, strange. In addition, I'm also interested in general questions of indigeneity and ethnicity, explicitly for teaching, actually. And in this lecture, I want to try to combine these topics. And this is what you will get from me. We are already finishing the introduction part. We will have a short look on indigeneity, the German situation, then at the US. Then we will look at the conflict between indigeneity versus individuality, what is really represented, language, and you read about that, and then short look to tribal museums, and then the conclusion. Let's start with indigeneity. When I use the term indigenous or indigeneity here, it mainly is a collective term for those who are the minorities known as American Indians, Native Americans, and Alaska Natives in the US, or First Nations, Inuit or Métis in Canada, which is important because they are all indigenous, but they have different legal status, legal rights, and things like that. But even if I do not want to get deeper into the discussion of the term indigenous in general, there are some remarks that seem to be important. I don't know if you have ever thought about the term. It's all over, indigene Völker. It's even in newspaper and wherever. It replaced Indianer, for example, and it doesn't make sense, honestly. But okay. Debating the rights of indigenous peoples since the late 1970s, the United Nations have helped to create a strengthening of indigenous self-consciousness all over the world. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2007 created a legal, if not binding, basis to fight for self-determination, but also for a global indigenous movement. While the United Nations do not use a fixed definition of what indigenous means and who is indigenous, it is usually used for minorities in settler colonial countries, or as the study on the problem of discrimination against indigenous peoples from 1983 defines, and I quote. And it's a definition which is old, but there's no definition at the UN, but if they use the definition, it's that. Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing in those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems, end of quote. The anthropologist Michael F. Brown points out that terms like tradition and heritage, which are also connected to indigenous very often, are resources actually that groups own and defend from competing interests. The problem is that in cases of doubt, this is associated with a primordialist and essentialist concept of culture, which is, I quote Cambriger, is primarily limited to visible characteristics such as clothing, appearance, or language. The famous American anthropologist James Clifford goes one step further. For him, indigeneitude, based on negritude, is a process of rearticulation that also involves the danger of self-stereotyping. Even if the global indigenous communities are different, he points out, and I just will quote the blue part here, indigeneitude is sustained through media disseminated images, including a shared symbolic repertoire, the sacred, Mother Earth, shamanism, sovereignty, the wisdom of elders, stewardship of the land, and so on. The images can lapse into self-stereotyping, and they express a transformative renewal of attachments to culture and place. It is difficult to know, sometimes even for participants, how much of the performance of identity reflects deep belief how much a tactical presentation of self, end of quote. Indigeneity, therefore, contains a strong political perspective that does not have the same relevance for all indigenous communities. Clifford, but also Rob Collins, emphasized that the term does not play a role for peoples who have strong kinship terms or political systems, such as the Native American tribes of the US. So if you go to the Lakota or the Comanche or whoever, they will be Comanche and Lakota. They will not be indigenous. That's their identity. And maybe they are even more, they would even say we are American Indians or Native Americans and not indigenous, because there's another perspective on that. Often, according to Clifford, they find it, quote, meaningful, the term indigenous, they find it meaningful only for university programs, transnational activists, and uprooted urbanists, end of quote. An essential component of the concept of indigeneity is that of self-determination, not only in relation to political goals, but also to the interpretation and representation of one's own culture and history. Since the 1970s, a rethink has taken place in anthropology, which has led to greater involvement of the researched with the writing culture debate, and is now often summarized as research with instead of research about or on. With critical indigenous studies in the early 2000s, indigenous studies also began to pay more attention to the indigenous perspective, albeit not always really critically. So the critical is something different from critical thinking. That's important in a way. And so it's not surprising that indigeneity has also arrived in museums which deal with it differently in different regions. They have in common that indigenous voices and perspectives are brought into exhibitions and public programs, and that museums choose cooperative approaches for their work. So we come to Germany. Clifford writes about the problematic term indigenous also, and I quote him, "It's a general name for human societies throughout the world that were often called primitive, native, tribal, or aboriginal," end of quote. So it's just a replacement for something else which is not politically correct anymore. And that's how it is used in most museum contexts. It is an alternative for source communities or societies of origin from all over the world. In German museums, indigeneity is particularly evident in the increasing cooperation with indigenous partners, what they use, which is taking place on very different levels. Oh, I forgot to show that Clifford quote, sorry. For example, there are a couple of exhibitions to which artists contribute as cultural experts or even co-curate it. There are situations like in the course of provenance or restitution projects in which cooperation takes place with official partner institutions of the countries concerned. So it's on a political level, on an official level, institutional level. There's the involvement of individual representatives of non-European societies who are consulted as experts on specific topics, but there are also exhibition projects in which the curators from Germany try to work together with the communities, whatever community means in that sense, in very various ways. These include, for example, what you can see a glimpse of on the right-hand side, the exhibition Against the Current, the Omaha Francis LaFleche and his collection in Berlin, which was done, curated in cooperation with, or maybe even collaboration, I don't know, with the Nebraska Indian Community College, which is an Omaha college, and lightning, symbol and snake dance, Abi Warburg and Pueblo art in the Museum am Roten Baum in Hamburg, which was also done during the pandemic, so they wanted to do more, but they did their best to cooperate with various tribal historic preservations offices. And what you can see is this has resulted, for example, in dealing with old photos by Abi Warburg or showing Abi Warburg, the art historian, which are not politically correct to show it anymore, and Hopi say, okay, you cannot show these photos. Actually, why could he even take these photos? And the museum wanted to show the photos. They wanted to show that they existed. So the deal was, okay, we show the photos, but we don't show it. So that's why you have the silhouettes only, to show there's something that should not be here, that should not be on the photo, actually. It's also important to note that most ethnographic museums regularly receive visitors from source communities who want to see the collections. Whether and how these contacts are really used is actually unclear to me. Even people I know very well and I talk to them, it's always unclear what happens after a visit. And I know that a couple of months ago there was I don't know where this Pawnee delegation or wherever they came from. They toured Germany and looked at the collections, and now one of the museum directors really wants to know what happens now. Why don't they ask anymore? She's really angry because the Pawnee, if they were Pawnee, I don't know, it doesn't matter, don't say anything anymore. And it's just, so I don't know where it leads to. So that's Germany, and it's a very general term, actually. Indigenous means just not from here. Any represented culture. The situation in North America is more developed since the cooperation with indigenous experts has a long tradition. As early as in the beginning of the 20th century, some museums like the Museum of Northern Arizona looked for consultants to interpret the collections. In the 1960s, it was almost common to ask for native expertise when a museum developed a new exhibition. At the same time, Native American groups and activists, individuals began to criticize the fact that their voices and knowledge played actually no role at that time in museums, and that cultural outsiders controlled the representation of their cultures and history. This changed when the first Native American artists and curators were permitted to do their own exhibitions in large Euro-American museums in the early 1970s. I cannot go into detail on that within 1 hour. Therefore, I quote Joaline Archambault, therefore, quote, the authority of museums to interpret the cultures of others, end of quote, had already begun to falter in the US when Joaline Archambault, anthropologist, Yanktonai Muskogee Cree from the Standing Rock Reservation, when she published the article American Indians and American Museums in the Zeitschrift für Ethnologie in 1993. The Native American Grace Protection Repatriation Act, which came into force in 1990 and was a direct response to the criticism of museums and their treatment of human remains and grave goods, played an important role in this change. However, museums were often just accused that in general all objects were stolen and or sacred and therefore had to be restituted. And I know that's something that happens here as well sometimes, that people think everything in museums is stolen. And we had a discussion a couple of months ago at the American Indian workshop, and one of the Iroquois participants said, we should not forget that some of these objects in museums were lovingly given to people. So they were not stolen, they were lovingly given. So it's interesting. The repatriation process following NAGPRA was originally scheduled to take only a few years, actually 5 years. And now it's a couple of years later, and it's still going on. As we have seen, it led to a forced cooperation for the museums, which, according to Dan L. Monroe, the longtime director of the Peabody Essex Museum, created a dialogue that led to mutual understanding and the recognition of different points of view. something which seemed to be very new to New York in a way. If you remember the first quote, actually, it was like, oh, now we have to talk about, maybe 30 years ago. At the same time, the law led to a deeper critical self-reflection among some, not all, public museums, which now began to reflect on the legitimacy of their ways of representation and at the same time to find a new approach to knowledge transfer. However, the latter, the knowledge transfer, was not new at this point in general, as American museums had already begun to democratize themselves and their exhibitions since the 1960s. The Canadian anthropologist Michael Ames used the term democratization to describe an opening of the museums to the target group, which now included children, workers, minorities, and physically disabled people in the 1960s, in contrast to a social elite that regarded museums as temples. At the same time, it became common practice to consult members of the groups featured in an exhibition, not only indigenous groups, and to undertake the curatorial interpretation together. So in the 1960s, a lot of things come together. It's not only about indigeneity. Chambaud emphasizes that this collaboration can lead to conflicts when curators and group members have different views. At the same time, however, she makes it clear that the result is improved and that the relationship between Native Americans and American museums has much potential for cooperation that is beneficial to both sides, a view which is shared by most museum officials. So if you talk to them, they say, it's very complicated, we will get in trouble, but yeah, it's worth it because the outcome is great. The changes driven by collaborative exhibitions led relatively quickly to a shared authority, as Amy Lonetree explains in her book, Decolonizing Museums, and Amy Lonetree is Ho-Chunk or Winnebago. And you read the last part of her book as well. The changes are part of the self-determination that has grown politically and legally since the 1970s, and the associated cultural sovereignty also. In her book, Lonetree examines how the institution can be decolonized based on various types of museums. She looks at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, a museum I will not talk about today, the hybrid tribal museum, Mille-Lacs Indian Museum in Minnesota, which is a museum of the Minnesota Historical Society, so it's a state museum, but it's for the Mille-Lacs band of Ojibwa, and the CB Wing Center of the Saginaw Chippewa in Michigan, which she considers exemplary for the growing number of tribal museums. And the book is 12 years old, and in some way it's old. That's interesting. It's just 12 years, but in a way it has to be rewritten. I do not think that it is relevant at this point to go into details about the respective exhibitions or museums. What is important is, however, that decolonization plays a central role for indigeneity in American museums, as it mainly means a change of authority in regards of the interpretation of stories, objects, and history. There are the 5 points you read about that. According to Lonetree's analysis, a museum exhibition must fulfill in order to decolonize, and you read about that. Decolonizing tells the hard truth. For Lonetree, individual aspects such as combating old stereotypes, incorporating indigenous voices, etc., are not enough to have a fully decolonizing effect. Rather, in her view, museums need to clearly articulate the problems of colonialism and take the indigenous perspective on history very seriously. If they do this constantly, Lonetree believes they can become places of healing and empowerment. She does not see this as something that can be achieved immediately, but something that must be understood as a long process. And it's one of her main concerns, actually, to tell the hard truth. And we will talk about that if it's really true. Decolonizing engages in collaborative methodology, involves more than just working with source communities or individuals, but involves consciously handing over control and power from the museums to those who are represented. Decisions and decision-making processes must also be communicated openly. Also a new thing to have conflict, to see how museums work, how strange they work. Decolonizing from sites of oppression to places that matter. Lone Tree ultimately only refers to the CB Wing Center to explain this aspect, but gives no clear indication of how a museum can be transformed from a heartful to a relevant place. So within the whole book, it's not really clear what steps do you have to do. However, it seems to me that the involvement of the entire community through long-term processes, which goes beyond a one-off visit by a possibly specialized group, is relevant here. Through the ongoing conversation, trust is built and topics are transported into the museums that are important to them, in contrast to a previous museum perspective. I interpret this from my tourism perspective. I work on tourism projects on Standing Rock and on the Standing Rock Reservation. And when they created their program, it was always important for them to involve the whole community, to explain what was going on, to ask them, what do you want to have? Not only some people, but the whole community. And that's, I think, what Lone Tree refers to. For her, it's also important that decolonizing goes beyond survivance, based on the hard truth. Actually, Lone Tree emphasizes here that it is not enough just to show that one is still alive and has survived. The truth must be so clear that the present can be understood against this background. Only then, in her opinion, is further development possible. Fifth and last, decolonizing is sharing indigenous knowledge. Sharing and using indigenous knowledge instead of old museum perspectives is, author mentions last, probably the framework that surrounds all of the other points. And you have read it, or you got the chance to read it. And I don't know if you realize that if you read these 5 points, they're not very detailed. It's still a lot of, okay, what do you really mean? How is that really, how do you want to develop that? And if you look at the last point, sharing indigenous knowledge, also brings responsibility to the indigenous partners, because they have to share knowledge. If they don't share knowledge, how can you decolonize? Also, if I say, okay, we need your knowledge to decolonize, then they have to give it. So it's really a problem. From the many conversations I have had with indigenous and non-indigenous colleagues in recent years and the exhibitions I've seen, it seems to me that contrary to Lone Tree's assumption from 22 years ago, the emphasis on the horrors of colonization is not the central element of decolonization in most American museums today and at all. The new Lakota exhibition was just being planned for the museum when the Minneapolis Institute of Arts faced indigenous protests in 1992, demanding the removal of the pipes from the Visions of the People exhibition because they were sacred. So that was a big special exhibition in the Art Institute, and protests were really all over the media, and so they had to really put the pipes out of the exhibition. In South Dakota, where they at that time planned the exhibition, the museum officials apparently reacted correctly again and instructed the curators not to plan with any pipes in the exhibition. Again, the museum had an advisory committee of well-known Lakota experts for the new exhibition, and these experts reacted with surprise to the planned ban. Nellie Starboyd Menard made it clear, she's Chicago Lakota, and I quote her, "How can you explain us if you do not use pipes?" End of quote. So at least one pipe, I think it's 2, became part of the exhibition without it ever being called a sacrilege. So it's in Minnesota, it was really like you must not show pipes, and South Dakota it was you must show. There's another similar example from the same museum. You can find examples like that all over the US. Until it closed a few months, it's almost 1.5 years ago. The exhibition also included a ghost dance shirt that had been worn at the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. It had been restituted in 1999 from the Cullingrove Museum in Glasgow to the Wounded Knee Survivors Association Hawk 1890, which in turn had given it to the Museum of the State Historical Society with the request that it be exhibited until a corresponding opportunity was created on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. During a conversation, former museum director Jay Vogt and curator Jay Smith, J&J, told me that at one point a group of Lakota students had been in the museum and after viewing the exhibit had demanded that the shirt had to be removed because it was disrespectful to display this sacred object. After meeting with the museum staff, during which the background to the display was explained to the students so they knew why it was there, the young Lakota withdrew their demand, realizing that they had no right to demand removal when the descendants of the victims of Wounded Knee had endorsed the display, even if they themselves had a different opinion. The examples show that museums can be simultaneously confronted with different views on the same object or topic and must have the means and experts to make decisions in one direction or the other, and then enforce and defend them against criticism. This in turn requires specialist knowledge within the institutions. At the same time, the cases presented also show that views on objects and themes and indigeneity can be dependent on spatially and temporally different perspectives, which are based on different knowledge among the actors. The Lakota artist, historian, and religious expert Arthur Amius assumes that urban Indians whose families have often lived in cities for several generations and no longer on reservations have suffered a great loss of traditional knowledge. He's very certain about that. This certainly cannot be denied, but this loss of knowledge is being replaced, in fact, by new perspectives, which have been gradually reflected since the beginning of the 20th century in pan-Indianism, the Red Power movement, or today in global indigeneity, and are therefore more activist than reservation perspectives. For Amiot, urban activists have, I quote him, romanticized a lot of the history and the traditions, end of quote, since the 1960s. Against this background, it is not surprising that the display of sacred objects was generally taboo in Minneapolis, while the Lakota in South Dakota had their individual, cultural, and contrary view. This example seems to be the perfect to show how indigeneity works in different contexts and uses shared knowledge in Clifford's sense when more specific knowledge is missing. And Arthur Amiot is explaining it in a longer sense. We had an interview about that. He has a very strong historical perspective telling how generations since the reservation era have changed their perspective on museums. So that's also interesting. Cannot go into that, but if we have time, I can explain it a little bit later. Another aspect is what you have read in the article by Davis and Krupa, the change of language as a specific aspect of indigeneity in museums. They write that the adaptation of language to indigenous ideas or the reclassification of, let's call them, object groups is a challenge for many museums as it contradicts the usual Western norms. And it has to be said that has anybody of you ever worked with a museum. They have norms and terms they have to use in the databases. And to change these terms is really difficult because it's used all over Germany, all over the US, maybe all over the world, and suddenly you have an indigenous term, you have to put that into that, and it does not really work, so it's a thing. Davis and Krupa write, language is a site of intervention into non-indigenous assumptions and practices that not only create barriers to consultation and repatriation, but also directly impacts collections care. End of quote. The topic came up to me not by this article actually, but when I co-produced the First Nation documentary, Let Them Speak, Commentaries from British Columbia. Originally planned as a small exhibition with artists interpreting the small Northwest Coast collection of the Weltkulturmuseum Frankfurt am Main, it had to be changed to a 34-minute documentation because of the pandemic. So we wanted to make this during the book fair in 2020, and we got money from Canada, which was the guest country. We could not do that, so they gave us the permission to do that documentary, and we hired an indigenous filmmaker, Diane Halson, to make this documentation. In this film, Viva, Megan O'Brien, Haida Kwakwaka'wakw, woodcarver Tom Hunt, Kwakwaka'wakw, and hip-hopper Christy Lee Charles, Musqueam, talk about their art and their relation to museums. All the statements show an ambivalent relationship to museums and collections. For a lot of indigenous peoples, not only them and people, the objects are witness to a past in which their own culture was almost destroyed by colonialism. But at the same time, so it's the horror of colonialism. But at the same time, they offer an opportunity to reconnect with their ancestors and learn old identity-forming craft techniques. It is therefore by no means unusual for museum anthropologists to be enthusiastic when they find particularly old or rare objects because they know what significance these objects can have for indigenous communities. And I point that out because I have a colleague in Frankfurt who's really bored when colleagues say, oh, I found this. This is the oldest. We had just a couple of weeks ago, we had an example. A colleague was in the Colloquium Americano, and she was working on a collection in Darmstadt, which had never seen, nobody had seen that for 200 years, actually. And she was like, oh, I found this pair of moccasins from West Greenland, and it's now the oldest pair of moccasins known in the world from the 18th century. And the colleague who doesn't like that is like, why is she so enthusiastic? Why is she, oh, that's so wonderful. It's a great piece. And he's like, why does she do that? It's because it has relevance for the indigenous people to see these old people. In her statement, Megan O'Brien points out that she knows many people who refer to objects as belongings because they belong to families. And Christy Lee Charles even says they are belongings, not just objects. When we translated the script for the subtitle, Mona Zurbi, who was the other co-producer, who was from the museum, and I decided not to translate that word as it seemed to be too ambiguous. So if we translate it into Eigentum, it would not really fit what it means. So we said, okay, we stay with this term. And it was really something where we learned about the relationship of indigenous people, of these indigenous people to the pieces in the exhibition. It was very helpful to have this term, actually. Davis and Krupa cite as examples the skeletons are no longer referred to as objects but as ancestors, or that museums recognize that objects that are considered dead things in our society are considered animate and alive in the society of origin and thus require a different treatment. And you read about that. The example of the Katsinam from the southwest of the US brought up by them is actually even more complicated than the article makes it appear. And I hope you remember that. This is because the Hopi make a clear distinction between the Katsina dolls, which are called Titu as a plural and Tihu singular, and you can see it lying here. Sorry. So they make a clear distinction between the Katsina dolls and the Katsina itself, the spirit beings. And when I co-curated an online exhibition about a collection of Titu, and Etche mentioned that Die Wanderer, diewanderer.info, when we worked on that online exhibition, we had a collection of Titu from the North American Native Museum in Zurich to work with. Nice collection, nobody had ever worked that, so we did this online exhibition. And the director of the museum, Heidrun Loeb, told us to call these Katsina figures because they were not dolls, they were not toys, but religious objects. We decided, okay, we don't want to get into this discussion. We call them just Tihu for one and Titu for more, so we used the Hopi term. At a symposium we organized 2 years later about the same topic, about the Titu representation of Titu in museums, it quickly became apparent that all the Hopi involved in the symposium spoke of dolls. Nobody said figures. Nobody said Titu. They just said dolls. When asked about this by Heidrun Loeb, actually, the Hopi women who had been given these dolls to during ceremonies when they were girls said, that's what they are. I quote them. They were dolls we played with. End of quote. According to them, the fact that they are also representations of the Katsina does not change this. They are religious objects and toys. It's not a contradiction. One of the representatives even emphasized that figures meant that they were sculptures like other works of art. But that is exactly what they were not. That's what she said. It even pains her to think of the dolls lying in museum drawers without being played with, because that's what they need as animate beings. They are toys and they have to be played with. And this is from this conference we were in the archives and look at the Katsina dolls lying there, so it's really it's obvious. Play with them. They're not figures, they're dolls to play with. While collaboration with the indigenous population is now standard practice in colonial museums in the US, it also requires mutual sensitivity and a sustainable willingness to work together, as museum work naturally follows certain rules that cannot always be changed. So it's again about this tension that can come up, and the longer you work together, the easier it is to stand these problems. Making compromises with colonial institutions can be quite risky for indigenous partners, as they must justify their actions and cooperation to indigenous critics. And that's something I was told by a lot of Native people working with museums or being involved in that we have to be aware that it's a colonial institution in the end, and a lot of people don't like these institutions. And if you work with this institution as an indigenous person, it can cause trouble for you. The situation is different in tribal museums, which are often also cultural centers and may display or house repatriated objects. They often aim both to an internal and external audience. Towards external visitors, they serve as a tool to show their own culture and history. Internally, they serve as meeting places or centers where tribal members can revitalize themselves with traditional arts and crafts or language, thus strengthening their identification as tribal members and thus forming or maintaining their identity. They can use their language and they can focus on what matters for the community, so that's quite easy in a way. Even if still it's a colonial concept which is used in indigenous communities, so it's also in a way strange. However, the museums can have a specific political dimension. By referring to the connection to land and the history, which is a common topic in indigenous things, they also justify land claims. In special cases such as the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center in Connecticut, They even serve to legitimize their own legal status as federally recognized tribe, which brings with it many special rights that other indigenous U.S. Americans, including Indians from, or American Indians, from non-federally recognized tribes, do not have. So it's complicated, but here it's really important for the Meshentucket Pequot. At a specific time, they had only 3 people living on the reservation. These were old women, and they died. And so it was really problematic situation. And now they built up a casino, and with the casino money, they built the museum and research center. So that's important. The Meshentucket Pequot had hired historians, anthropologists, and other non-indigenous scientists to collect colonial documents, historical and anthropological data. All these colonial documents were necessary to obtain the legal status as federally recognized. On this basis, the exhibition was created and tells a story of continuance from the crossing of the Bering Strait to today. In this extreme case, decolonization takes place by applying colonial methods that justify a special indigenous status, and it proves that political aspects of indigeneity in museums. So that's just one photo, but if you enter it, the first part is really, you can see Ice Age and people crossing the Bering Strait, and it goes through the time and connects also to other cultures in North America, just to say we are still the people we were when we crossed the Bering Strait 10,000 years ago. And it's even the Euro-American perspective on history, actually, that they follow because they have to follow that. Conclusion. As we have hopefully seen, indigeneity and the resulting demands pose great challenges for museums, which now are mostly seen as opportunity, at least in the US. The role that indigeneity plays can vary considerably in individual cases. From the exhibition of indigenous artists to indigenous curators or indigenous museums, anything is possible. Decolonization always plays a major role, but what is understood by this in individual cases depends on the respective indigenous perspective, or individual perspective, or Native American perspective, or Lakota perspective, which is usually not based on indigeneity, but on individual self-identification. So if you talk to people, ask them, what are you? Is it just indigenous, or is it something else? But the case of the pipes show how some groups may need new narratives to build their identity or self-identification. It shows how indigeneity or indigeneitude is a process of re-articulation, even if it can be built on shared symbols that are close to self-stereotyping. Thank you very much, and I hope I'm in time. Thank you.